The night air in New York City was cold, sharp, and unforgiving. The bustling streets were filled with the sounds of honking horns and the hurried steps of people trying to avoid the frost as they made their way home. But in the grand penthouse apartment on the top floor of a luxury building in Manhattan, something far more sinister was unfolding. At around midnight, the silence in the apartment was broken by the loud bang of gunfire. The body of Vince Moretti, a notorious Mafia lord, lay sprawled across the marble floor of his own living room. His hands, once powerful and controlling, now lay lifeless by his side. Blood pooled around him, staining the pristine white carpet. His eyes, once filled with the sharpness of a man who ruled with fear, stared blankly at the high ceiling. Vince had it all: money, power, respect. For years, he controlled the underground world of New York with an iron fist. No one dared cross him. His word was law. But now his empire was in ruins. Vince had been played, and the people responsible for his downfall lay dead beside him. The two bodies beside him were those of his wife, Elena, and his longtime mistress, Carmen. Both women had been killed with ruthless efficiency, their lives snuffed out in an instant. Elena, his wife of 15 years, had been the picture of grace and loyalty, or so he thought. Carmen, on the other hand, had always been a secret indulgence, a beautiful woman with a sharp wit and even sharper ambitions. And now both women lay lifeless in his home, victims of a betrayal so deep it could only be described as treacherous. The world around Vince was collapsing, but it wasn't just the women in his life that had turned on him. The real betrayal came from his business empire, the one he had spent decades building. Unknown to him, Elena and Carmen had orchestrated a series of maneuvers that had bled Vince dry. They had tricked him into a series of bad investments, fake business deals, and financial traps that had left him bankrupt. But that wasn't all. They had been planning his downfall for months, working together with a shadowy figure in Vince's world, a trusted advisor who had long been in his inner circle. But there was one more person Vince had to worry about. The one person who could unravel everything. The one person who could piece the puzzle together. That person was Detective Isabella Rossi. Isabella Rossi was known throughout the NYPD as a seasoned investigator with an impeccable track record. She had a reputation for solving cases others couldn't, digging deeper when the truth was buried under layers of lies. As soon as the call came through about the double murder at the Moretti penthouse, she was on the case. By the time she arrived at the scene, the forensics team was already at work, cataloging every piece of evidence while officers cordoned off the area. Isabella stepped out of her black SUV, adjusting her coat as she surveyed the building's entrance. The penthouse was one of the most expensive in the city, located in the heart of Manhattan's financial district. From the outside, it looked like any other high-rise in the city, sleek and modern, with windows that reflected the light of the city's skyline. But Isabella knew the truth was never as simple as appearances. Detective Rossi, one of the officers greeted her as she entered the building. Everything's been sealed off. We're just waiting for you to begin the investigation. Isabella nodded, her mind already racing through the possibilities. She had seen countless crime scenes in her career, but this one was different. This was personal. Vince Moretti wasn't just another criminal. He was a power player, a man with connections that reached deep into the heart of the city. If he had been killed, there was no telling who would be next. "Show me the bodies," she said coldly, her voice steady despite the chaos in her mind. The officer led her to the penthouse elevator and pressed the button for the top floor. As they ascended, Isabella couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. She had worked in this city long enough to know that nothing was ever as it seemed. She'd have to dig deep to uncover the truth. But tonight, she was ready. The elevator doors opened, and Isabella stepped into the luxury apartment. The scene before her was one of horror. Blood splattered across the white walls, the bodies of Elena and Carmen lying next to Vince's lifeless form. As she surveyed the scene, Isabella's mind clicked into overdrive. She immediately noticed the lack of struggle, the clean precision of the shots that had killed each woman. Whoever had done this knew what they were doing, and whoever had done this was no stranger to death. Isabella moved closer to the bodies, taking note of the positions they were in. Elena, dressed in a silk nightgown, had been shot in the chest. Carmen, dressed in a tight black dress, had suffered the same fate, and Vince, the most important target, had been shot in the head. The investigator's trained eyes scanned the room for clues. Her fingers brushed lightly across a blood-stained piece of paper lying on the floor. It was a receipt, printed just hours before the murders. She carefully pocketed it before continuing her investigation. Her instincts told her this was no ordinary crime. This was calculated. The sound of footsteps behind her made her turn around. It was the forensics team who had just finished their initial sweep of the scene. "Detective, we found something interesting," one of the technicians called to her. Isabella approached him, her eyes narrowing. He held up a small folder containing documents that were clearly financial in nature. "This is what we found hidden in Vince Moretti's office," the technician explained. "It looks like a series of fake contracts, bad investments, and a few things that seem off." Isabella took the folder, her eyes skimming through the pages. The name that stood out most was Elena Moretti's. She had been involved in these deals, but the deeper she dug, the more questions she had. Why had Elena and Carmen been working together behind Vince's back? What had driven them to such an extreme? The pieces were starting to fall into place, but Isabella knew this was only the beginning. The truth was buried beneath layers of lies, and she was determined to uncover it. But first, she needed to understand what had led to this brutal, bloody night. With a deep breath, Isabella turned back to the bodies, the mystery ahead of her unraveling like an intricate puzzle. The game had just begun. The New York night was colder than usual as Detective Isabella Rossi stood in the middle of the penthouse, a somber silence surrounding her. She had been at crime scenes before, but something about this one felt different. There was an unease in the air, as if the walls themselves were hiding the truth. The forensics team continued their work, carefully combing through every corner of the apartment. They were thorough, but Isabella's mind raced ahead. She had seen the patterns of criminal behavior before, but this case was more intricate, too well planned for a mere act of passion. It smelled like betrayal, and betrayal often had more layers than the average murder investigation. Isabella stepped over the blood-stained carpet, her shoes pressing softly against the cold marble floors. She knelt by the bodies of Elena and Carmen. Elena's once beautiful face had a peaceful expression, almost as if she were asleep. Carmen's expression, however, was one of shock, her eyes wide open in disbelief at her untimely fate. Both women were dressed in their finest clothes, as if they had been caught in the middle of something they never anticipated. Then there was Vince. His body sprawled across the living room, the blood from his fatal wound still fresh. He was the obvious target. A Mafia lord, once untouchable, had been taken down in a ruthless execution. But this wasn't a random hit. This was personal. Isabella felt it deep in her gut. "Detective," one of the officers interrupted her thoughts, stepping into the room with a phone in hand. "We've located a few people who may be involved. It's complicated." Isabella stood up slowly, taking the phone. "What do you mean complicated?" "There's a man named Marco Santini. He's a high-level business associate of Moretti, but he's also been linked to Elena and Carmen. We don't know exactly how, but there's something here." "Send me everything you have on Santini," Isabella instructed, her voice cold and steady. Marco Santini. That name meant something. She had heard whispers of him, an enigmatic figure with connections in both legitimate businesses and the underworld. A man with wealth, power, and an aura of danger. But why would he be connected to Moretti's wife and mistress? What was their relationship, and why hadn't anyone mentioned him before? She disconnected the call and stepped away from the scene, her mind churning with new possibilities. There were too many questions and no answers. Yet, Isabella's office at the NYPD was far from the glamour of the city's high-rises. It was a small, cluttered space with stacks of files piled high on her desk and a window that looked out over the sprawling city below. She preferred it that way. No distractions, just her and the case. She had sent for the initial autopsy reports and was now reviewing them, scanning through the details. Vince Moretti had been shot once in the head with a .45 caliber handgun, an execution-style kill. No struggle, no defensive wounds. Elena and Carmen had both been shot in the chest, but what struck her as odd was the timing of the deaths. Elena had been shot first, and then Carmen mere moments later. That indicated someone who knew exactly what they were doing. This wasn't random violence. It was methodical. But why kill them both? And why now? Her phone buzzed, pulling her out of her thoughts. She glanced at the screen, an incoming call from Detective James Burke, her partner in this case. "Isabella," he said, his voice rough and tired. "I've got something you need to see." "What is it?" she asked, already standing from her desk, her hand gripping the edge of the table. "I've just returned from the Santini estate. There's a lot more here than we thought. Are you telling me Santini is involved?" Isabella's voice was sharp. "Not directly involved, no. But someone connected to him was, and we're starting to piece it together. I think you need to see this in person." Isabella didn't hesitate. She grabbed her coat, her mind now fully focused on Marco Santini and his potential role in this conspiracy. She had a feeling that he wasn't just a bystander in this tragedy. No, he was connected to something much darker, and she was about to uncover how deep that connection ran. The Santini estate was just as luxurious as the penthouse, if not more. The sprawling mansion on the outskirts of the city had a gated entrance and towering iron fences that kept prying eyes at bay. A private security team guarded the perimeter, ensuring that nothing from the inside ever made its way to the outside. Marco Santini didn't deal with ordinary people. He played with the power players, the people who made decisions in shadows, who held the true reins of power in the city. Detective Burke led Isabella through the massive front door and into a grand foyer. The estate was a picture of wealth, its polished wood floors and towering ceilings designed to make a statement. But Isabella wasn't interested in the luxury. She was focused on the investigation, and right now the investigation led her here. "We've got a break in the case," Burke said, walking ahead to the study. "In Santini's office." Isabella followed, her mind still racing through the clues she had uncovered so far. She had suspected that there was more to the story of Vince's downfall, and she knew now that Marco Santini was tied to it. The question was how, and more importantly, why. When they reached Santini's office, Burke opened the door, revealing a room filled with documents, files, and business contracts scattered across the desk. But one particular file stood out. Burke pulled it from the pile and handed it to Isabella. "This is what you need to see," he said. Isabella flipped through the file, her eyes scanning the pages quickly. It was a record of business deals, all of them tied to Vince Moretti and his failing empire. The deeper she looked, the more she realized that this wasn't just about money. It was about control. Elena and Carmen had been playing a dangerous game, but they weren't alone. Santini was right there, pulling strings behind the scenes. The final page of the file caught her eye. It was a contract, a signed agreement between Elena Moretti and Marco Santini, granting him control over a large chunk of Vince's business. It wasn't just about money anymore. It was about power. Elena and Carmen had set Vince up, tricking him into signing away everything he had worked for. And Santini was the mastermind, pulling the strings all along. "Do you see it now?" Burke asked, his voice low. Santini was the one who orchestrated the entire downfall. Elena and Carmen were just the pawns. Isabella's heart raced as the truth began to take shape. It wasn't just a family tragedy. This was something far more dangerous. A conspiracy to take down one of the most powerful men in New York. But Santini wasn't just some secondary player. He was the puppet master. She looked at Burke, her eyes filled with determination. "We've just scratched the surface. This goes much deeper. We need to find out exactly what Santini is hiding. He's not going to get away with this." The investigation had just become even more complicated. There were more pieces to this puzzle, and Isabella was determined to find them all. The Mafia had many enemies, but in the world of crime, betrayal ran deeper than blood, and Marco Santini had betrayed them all. The investigation had just taken a sharp turn, and Detective Isabella Rossi could feel the weight of what lay ahead. The evidence in front of her painted a dark picture. Vince Moretti, the Mafia lord who had once ruled with an iron fist, was not merely a victim of a violent attack. He was the final casualty of a carefully orchestrated plot. Elena Moretti, his wife, and Carmen, his mistress, had not acted alone. The true mastermind had been Marco Santini, a man with connections far beyond the criminal underworld. But now Isabella had to figure out exactly why Santini had masterminded Vince's ruin. What had he gained from the chaos he had caused? Isabella stepped out of the Santini estate and into her car, her mind buzzing with the new information. Burke had already made arrangements for the forensics team to process the documents from Santini's office. Now it was her job to make sense of it all. She knew she couldn't do this alone. There were too many moving parts in this case, and someone needed to pull them together before they fell apart. The next morning, Isabella gathered with her team in the NYPD's investigation room. It was a small space filled with whiteboards, sticky notes, and corkboards, covered in photos of the victims, suspects, and places involved in the case. The walls were covered in string, each piece of thread connecting someone or something to the murders. This was her turf now, and she was determined to follow the threads wherever they led. "All right, let's get to work," Isabella said, addressing her team. "We have 2 dead women, 1 dead man, and a whole lot of unanswered questions. We need to focus on 2 things today: Marco Santini and the timeline of events that led to this moment. We know that Elena and Carmen didn't act alone. Santini's fingerprints are all over this, and I want to know exactly how he managed to convince them to betray Moretti." Detective James Burke stepped forward with a thick folder in his hand. "We've been digging into Santini's business dealings. A few things stood out immediately. First, his real estate empire is massive, far beyond what anyone has publicly known. He's been involved in several shady business deals, ones that can't be traced back to him directly. Second, there's a connection to a man named Luca DeMarco, a notorious enforcer in the criminal world. Santini and DeMarco are old acquaintances. They've been seen together at various social events, but there's one meeting that stands out." Isabella's interest peaked at the mention of Luca DeMarco. "What meeting?" Burke flipped through a few pages of his report and found what he was looking for. It was a private meeting between Santini, DeMarco, and a third man, someone we don't have a name for yet. The meeting took place about 6 months ago, just around the time the Morettis started running into financial problems. Santini and DeMarco were seen leaving a high-end restaurant together, but the third man, he hasn't been identified. We're trying to track down the records now, but it's clear that whatever happened in that meeting set the stage for what we're seeing now." Isabella leaned in, her eyes narrowing. "This third man, if we can identify him, he could be key to understanding Santini's role in everything. He's probably the one who helped orchestrate the final steps of Moretti's downfall." "Keep pushing for that lead." Burke nodded and sat back down at his desk, already dialing his phone to follow up with his sources. Isabella turned her attention to the photos pinned to the wall. There was Elena smiling in an old family photo with Vince. Next to it was a picture of Carmen at a social event, looking every bit the glamorous woman who had managed to hold Vince's attention. And then there was Marco Santini, standing in the background of several pictures, always dressed impeccably, always lurking just out of direct view. Isabella studied the photos for a moment longer before turning to the rest of the team. "We need to get into Santini's finances. He's a businessman, so he must be keeping records of everything. Burke, I need you to keep working with the financial experts to untangle his web of transactions. We need to figure out exactly how he played both Moretti and the women involved." The team scattered, each person assigned to a specific task. Isabella leaned back in her chair, taking a long breath. She had a feeling that this was just the beginning. Santini wasn't going to go down easily, and if what she suspected was true, his ties reached far beyond the criminal world. He had played a dangerous game, and now the stakes were higher than ever. Meanwhile, Marco Santini was doing what he did best, maintaining control. Sitting in his luxurious office, he stared out the window, watching the New York skyline as he thought about the events of the last few days. It had all gone according to plan. Elena and Carmen were dead, and Vince Moretti was no longer a threat. His empire was safe. But things weren't as simple as they seemed. Santini knew that the NYPD wouldn't just let the case go. Detective Isabella Rossi was relentless. He'd heard about her from his contacts in the police department, a skilled investigator, known for finding connections that others couldn't. He couldn't let her get too close. His mind was already working on his next move. He needed to cover his tracks and, if necessary, eliminate anyone who could tie him to the murders. He had a few people in mind. men and women who had worked for him over the years, people who knew too much. If things got too dangerous, they would have to be removed. Santini had built his empire on manipulation and secrecy, and he was determined to protect it at all costs. As he sat there, contemplating his next steps, his phone rang. He answered it without hesitation. "It's done," the voice on the other end said. Santini's lips curled into a satisfied smile. "Good. Now we make sure no one connects us to the crime. Keep everything tight. No loose ends." He hung up, his mind already turning toward how to keep Rossi off his scent. But in the back of his mind, a tiny seed of doubt began to grow. What if Isabella Rossi was already closer than he thought? Back at the NYPD, Isabella was busy sifting through financial documents that Burke had provided. She had already learned a great deal about Marco Santini's business operations. He had his hands in numerous industries, but the more she dug, the more she realized that his empire was built on manipulation and underhanded dealings. Santini wasn't just a businessman, he was a puppet master. He controlled entire sectors of the economy, from real estate to private security to high-end investments. But there was one thing that stood out above all else. A significant amount of money had been funneled into offshore accounts, and many of those accounts had been linked to shell companies. It wasn't just financial fraud, it was money laundering on a massive scale. And it was clear that Vince Moretti's business, the one Santini had set out to destroy, was about to collapse under the weight of these fraudulent deals. Isabella sat back in her chair, letting the information sink in. Santini wasn't just after Moretti's business. He was after power, absolute control over a criminal empire that stretched across multiple industries. Moretti had stood in his way, and now Santini had taken him out of the equation. But there was still one piece left to this puzzle, the third man from the meeting Santini had had with DeMarco. Isabella had a feeling that if she could find out who that man was, she would uncover the final secret Santini was desperately trying to protect. But finding him wouldn't be easy. The game was getting more dangerous, and Isabella knew that time was running out. The deeper she went, the more she realized that Santini wasn't just a mafia lord. He was the architect of a criminal empire that threatened to swallow everything in its path, and he wouldn't go down without a fight. The days felt longer now. Detective Isabella Rossi could sense the walls closing in, both on the investigation and on Marco Santini. He had been clever, but not clever enough. She could feel the layers of deception falling away, one by one. Every clue, every connection, was drawing her closer to the heart of his empire. But she needed more. She needed the truth. Isabella sat at her desk late one night, the glow from her desk lamp casting long shadows in the otherwise dark office. She had just received another round of information from the financial experts. The offshore accounts, the shell companies, they were all tied back to Santini's legitimate businesses. But the deeper she looked, the more she realized something she hadn't expected. The money was also connected to one person who had been notably absent from the investigation thus far. Luca DeMarco, the enforcer. Luca DeMarco was no ordinary thug. He was a man of violence, but he was also a man of strategy. Isabella had heard rumors of his work in the underworld, his ruthlessness in handling problems, but his connection to Santini had always been murky. Now she had proof that he was more involved than anyone had originally thought. It wasn't just that he was Santini's enforcer. DeMarco was one of the key players behind the curtain, a man who had helped build Santini's empire through intimidation, violence, and manipulation. But something didn't sit right. Why had DeMarco been involved in the plot to destroy Vince Moretti? And why had Santini been working so hard to cover his tracks? They weren't just taking down a rival, they were erasing a business empire. This wasn't just about power, it was about control, total control. And behind it all was a figure Isabella hadn't yet been able to identify. The third man in the meeting Santini and DeMarco had had months ago. The next day, Isabella and Burke met in the cramped investigation room. The tension in the air was thick. Both of them knew they were getting closer, but neither was certain how close. It was like walking a tightrope, every step taking them further into the unknown. "All right," Burke started, looking over the new information. "I've been digging through the records of the meeting Santini had with DeMarco, trying to identify the third man. I found something interesting." Isabella raised an eyebrow. What is it? Burke slid a photograph across the table to her. It was grainy, taken from a security camera outside a high-end restaurant. The image was of three men walking into the building, two recognizable figures, Santini and DeMarco, but the third man was obscured. However, Burke had already done the work. He had matched the image to an old photo in their database. "It's Carmine the Ghost Russo," Burke said, his voice low. Isabella's blood ran cold. The name sent a chill through her spine. Carmine Russo, once the right-hand man of an even larger mafia boss, had disappeared from the scene over a decade ago. He had been presumed dead after a violent turf war that wiped out his entire crew. But now here he was, in the flesh, aligning himself with Marco Santini. It made sense in a twisted way. Russo had always been a man of power, of quiet control. He had the kind of ruthlessness that Santini admired and needed. "Russo," Isabella murmured, her voice hardening. "He should be dead." Burke shook his head. "No one really knows what happened to him. He vanished, but there were rumors. Some said he went into hiding. Others said he was working in the shadows, building a network of influence. It looks like those rumors were true. He's been hiding in plain sight, helping Santini consolidate power." Isabella stood up, pacing back and forth. "Russo's the key to everything. He's the one who's been pulling the strings with DeMarco. He's the one who helped Santini dismantle Moretti's empire. He's the one who—" "Wait," Burke interrupted, pulling her attention back. "There's more. I went through the bank statements of the accounts linked to Russo. There's one name that keeps popping up. It's the same name that's on the contract between Santini and Elena Moretti. Lydia Callahan." Isabella froze. Lydia Callahan? That name hadn't come up in any of her previous investigation notes. She had no idea who this person was, but the fact that her name appeared on the contract between Santini and Elena meant something important. The dots were connecting, but there were still pieces missing. Who was Lydia Callahan, and why was she so involved? Later that day, Isabella and Burke were in a quiet cafe, reviewing the new lead on Lydia Callahan. It was a high-end place, not far from the city's financial district, where people went to do business or to lay low. Isabella needed to meet with someone who could help them dig deeper into this new name, someone who had connections in the business world, someone who knew how to dig into people's lives without being detected. "Lydia Callahan is tied to a series of shell companies," Isabella said as she scrolled through her tablet, "and the companies are all connected to people who were working for Santini. I'm guessing you've got someone in mind to help us?" Burke asked, sipping his coffee. "Yeah," Isabella said, looking up. "I've got a friend in the private sector. She specializes in financial forensics. She'll help us trace this Callahan woman's involvement." Burke raised an eyebrow. "How reliable is she?" "Very," Isabella replied firmly. "She's helped me on cases like this before. If there's one thing she's good at, it's finding people who don't want to be found." Within hours, Isabella was in a small office in the heart of Manhattan, meeting with her contact, Catherine "Cat" Parker, a former financial analyst who had turned to working with law enforcement to help uncover financial crimes. Cat's office was stark and sterile, nothing like the warmth of a home or the comfort of a well-established law firm. It was a space designed for one thing: work. Cat was a short woman with sharp features and piercing blue eyes that never missed a detail. She greeted Isabella with a nod as the detective walked in. "I've heard about the Moretti case. Looks like you're digging into some serious players." "You're right," Isabella said, sliding a folder across the table. "I need your help. I need to know everything about Lydia Callahan. The more you can find, the better." Kat didn't hesitate. She opened the folder, glancing over the documents inside. "Leave it to me. I'll start pulling the strings and let you know what I find." It was late in the evening when Kat finally called Isabella with an update. "I've got something," Kat said, her voice low. "Lydia Callahan is an alias. Her real name is Lydia Russo. She's Carmine Russo's daughter." Isabella's heart skipped a beat. "You're telling me the third man is Russo's daughter? That's huge," Kat continued. "I don't have all the details yet, but I've traced her through several business dealings tied to Santini and the Morettis. She's been the silent partner in several of Santini's investments, and she's been manipulating the books from behind the scenes." It all clicked. Lydia Russo had been hiding in plain sight, using the name Callahan to cover her. The fall of Moretti's empire with the help of her father, Carmine Russo, and the brutal enforcer, Luca DeMarco. Together, they had manipulated Elena and Carmen, playing them like pawns in a much larger game. Isabella clenched her fists, the pieces finally coming together. This ends now. But as Isabella prepared to confront Santini and his empire, she knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Marco Santini, Luca DeMarco, and Lydia Russo were a powerful force, and they wouldn't give up without a fight. The game was far from over, but now Isabella had the key to the entire operation, and she would stop at nothing to bring them down. Isabella's thoughts raced as she sat in her car outside the Santini estate. The investigation had reached a boiling point. The truth was almost within reach, but there was still one thing that nagged at her. Santini had to be stopped, but he wasn't going to go down quietly. He had his entire network of criminals and influential people behind him. And now, with the discovery of Lydia Russo, the last piece of the puzzle had fallen into place. Lydia Russo had been the key player in the destruction of Vince Moretti, working alongside her father, Carmine Russo, and the notorious enforcer, Luca DeMarco. But more than that, Lydia had been the mastermind behind the financial collapse, pulling the strings from behind the scenes, while Santini had pretended to be the public face of the operation. It was her cunning that had led to the betrayal of Elena and Carmen, who had been so easily manipulated into helping take down Vince. Isabella couldn't help but feel a pang of disgust. Santini, DeMarco, Russo, all of them had used the women as pawns in their twisted game of power and control. Elena and Carmen had been no more than tools in a much larger scheme, their lives traded away for the sake of greed and ambition. But the truth was, this wasn't just about a woman's betrayal. This was about the unraveling of an empire. Moretti had built his wealth and power over decades, and now Santini and his associates were picking apart the pieces of that empire like vultures. In the end, all that mattered was money and control. Isabella arrived at the precinct, where her team was already waiting. Burke was flipping through pages of documents, his face drawn with the exhaustion of a long investigation. He looked up as she walked in. "We're close," Isabella said, her voice low but determined. "We have all the pieces we need. It's time to bring down Santini and his empire." Burke nodded. "I'm with you. What's the plan?" Isabella paused, letting the weight of the moment sink in. "We hit him hard. We take down his financials, his associates, and his ties to Russo and DeMarco. But we need to act fast. The longer we wait, the more time Santini has to cover his tracks. We'll go after the people who are closest to him first, those who can flip and turn on him. We've already got enough evidence to bring him in. Once he's in custody, we can start unraveling his connections to Russo and DeMarco." "I'll start coordinating with the DA," Burke said, grabbing his phone. "You want to get Santini, right? I can start with Russo and DeMarco if you prefer." Isabella thought for a moment. "Number Santini's the ringleader. I'll take care of him myself. We'll move in tonight. Keep your phone on you. If anything goes wrong, I'll call." With the plan in place, the team split up to begin executing the takedown. Isabella didn't waste any time. She walked out of the room, her mind already focused on Santini. She had come this far, and she wouldn't stop until he was behind bars. The Santini estate was heavily guarded, a fortress built to protect its secrets. Isabella knew that going in would be risky. Santini had always been paranoid, and he had more than enough muscle to fight back. But she had no choice. He was the heart of the operation, and without him, the rest of his empire would crumble. As Isabella approached the gates of the estate, her heart beat faster. This was it. She had never been so close to bringing down a criminal of Santini's stature. But the stakes were high. One wrong move, and everything could fall apart. She radioed in her team. "We're going in. I need backup on standby." Burke's voice crackled through the earpiece. "Copy that. We'll be there in 10. With a deep breath, Isabella signaled her team to move forward. They approached the main entrance, weapons drawn but low, ready for anything. The heavy doors of the mansion loomed in front of them, guarded by two men who were clearly on high alert. But they didn't have a chance. Before they could react, Isabella's team had them subdued and handcuffed, their weapons taken from them. "Move fast," Isabella whispered. "We need to find Santini." They moved through the grand hallways of the mansion, their footsteps echoing on the polished marble floors. Isabella's mind was sharp, her senses heightened. Every shadow could be a threat, every corner could hide an enemy. But there was no turning back now. They reached the main staircase and Isabella signaled her team to spread out. As they ascended the stairs, Isabella's thoughts briefly flickered back to the investigation. It had been a long road to get here. The nights spent going over files, the interviews with witnesses, the long hours spent tracking down leads. It all came to this moment. She was ready. The door at the end of the hallway was ajar, and Isabella could see Santini standing by the window, overlooking the city below. His back was turned, but even from behind, she could see the arrogance in his posture. He hadn't expected this. He thought he was invincible. Isabella's voice was cold as she stepped into the room. "Marco Santini, you're under arrest for the murder of Elena Moretti, Carmen DeLuca, and the attempted murder of Vince Moretti, along with multiple counts of fraud, racketeering, and money laundering." Santini's head snapped around, and for a brief moment, Isabella could see the panic flash in his eyes. But it was quickly replaced with a cold, calculating smile. "You think you've won, detective?" Santini's voice was low, smooth, and laced with venom. "You think arresting me will stop everything? You're wrong. You're just a pawn in a much bigger game. My empire, it's untouchable." Isabella didn't flinch. She had seen men like him crumble before, and Santini wouldn't be any different. "The game's over, Santini," she said, stepping closer. "And I'm the one holding the cards now." With a swift motion, one of her officers moved in and cuffed Santini. He struggled briefly, but there was no escaping this. It was over. Santini had lost. Later that night, Isabella stood outside the Santini estate, looking at the flashing lights of the police cars and the people being taken into custody. The operation had gone as smoothly as she could have hoped, but the battle wasn't over yet. There were still many more people involved in Santini's empire: Russo, DeMarco, and the others who had helped him destroy Moretti. They would be next. Isabella felt a deep sense of satisfaction, but also a quiet emptiness. She had brought down the man who had caused so much pain, but the consequences of his actions would ripple through the city for years to come. The Moretti family, Elena, Carmen, they were gone, and the damage had already been done. But the city had its justice, and that was enough. As she turned to leave, Burke's voice came over the radio. "Isabella, we've got a lead on Russo's location. We're moving in now." Isabella paused, a determined look crossing her face. "Let's finish this," she said, her voice steady. The investigation was far from over. The empire might have fallen, but the fight was still raging. The game was still on. But Santini's reign had ended tonight. Isabella's mind had been racing ever since Santini's arrest. Despite the satisfaction of seeing the notorious Mafia boss behind bars, there was still so much left to unravel. Santini was just one piece of the puzzle, and now she had to bring down the rest of the empire. The people who had worked with him in the shadows, who had helped him manipulate everything from the financial world to the lives of the Morettis. The next target was Carmine Russo, the elusive figure behind the scenes, pulling the strings without ever showing his face. Burke had already set up a meeting with a team of officers and intelligence analysts to track down Russo's whereabouts. They had received a lead on his location, and it was as close to the truth as they were going to get for now. According to their intel, Russo had been hiding in plain sight, operating out of a small building in a seedy part of the city, a place untouched by the luxurious lifestyle Santini had come to enjoy. Isabella sat in her car, the headlights from passing vehicles flashing in the rearview mirror. She had never been this close to catching Russo, and she couldn't afford to mess this up. Her mind kept returning to the people who had been caught in the middle of Santini's rise to power: Elena Moretti, Carmen DeLuca, and the rest of their family. They had been part of a plan they had no control over, pawns in a much larger game. They had been betrayed by everyone they trusted, and now it was her job to make sure their deaths weren't in vain. "Detective Rossi," Burke's voice came over the radio. "We've confirmed Russo's location. We're ready to move in. He's holed up in a building on Washington Avenue. We'll need to move fast. We don't know if he's alone." "I'm on my way," Isabella replied, her hand gripping the steering wheel tighter. Her pulse was quickening. This was it, the final push. She had been in this situation countless times, but tonight was different. The stakes had never been this high, and the danger felt more real than it ever had before. By the time Isabella arrived at the location, the area was swarming with officers and SWAT teams, each one moving with the precise synchronization of a well-oiled machine. The building was run down, a place where forgotten souls disappeared, left to linger in the shadows. But inside, Carmine Russo was waiting. He wouldn't go down without a fight. As Isabella and Burke entered the building, their footsteps echoing in the hollow silence, she couldn't shake the feeling of unease. Everything had led them here, to this moment, but something still didn't sit right. She had a nagging thought in the back of her mind, one that had been growing over the past few days. Had they been too focused on Russo? Was there something or someone else pulling the strings? Isabella, Burke whispered, his voice tense. We've got eyes on the door. He's inside. Isabella nodded, her expression hardening. They had been waiting for this moment, but she wasn't about to walk in blindly. Make sure you have every exit covered, she said. We can't let him slip through our fingers now. The team moved with precision, sweeping the building floor by floor, clearing each room as they went. The building creaked under the pressure of their movements, the walls holding secrets that had been buried for years. Each step took them closer to the man who had been at the heart of so much violence. But Isabella knew better than to think this would be easy. They reached the top floor of the building, and there it was, Carmine Russo's hideout. The door was slightly ajar, a faint light spilling from the crack. Isabella motioned for her team to hold their positions as she stepped forward, her hand on her weapon. She took a deep breath and then kicked the door open. Inside, the room was dark and filled with the smell of stale air and cigarette smoke. Carmine Russo sat in a chair, his back to them. The room was sparse, nothing more than a few old leather chairs and a dusty desk. But Russo was not surprised. He had been waiting. I knew you'd come eventually, Detective. Russo's voice was calm, almost amused. You've been hunting me for months, but you're too late. The damage is done. Isabella didn't flinch. She stepped forward, her voice firm. The damage isn't done yet, Russo. It's over. You're under arrest for the murders of Elena Moretti, Carmen DeLuca, and for your role in the destruction of Vince Moretti's empire. Russo laughed, a low, gravelly sound that echoed in the silence. Do you really think you can stop it? You think arresting me will make all of this go away? He turned slowly in his chair, his eyes locking onto Isabella's with cold precision. I've been planning this for years. Santini was just a pawn in my game. You think he was the mastermind? No, Detective. It was always me. Isabella's heart skipped a beat. Russo was the mastermind. It didn't make sense. Everything she had believed, everything they had uncovered, pointed to Santini being the key figure. But here was Russo, admitting that he had been in control the whole time. She had known he was dangerous, but this was something else entirely. Russo, Burke said, his voice trembling slightly, you're done. The evidence against you is overwhelming, is it? Russo sneered. You have nothing. You don't understand how this world works, Detective. You think you're bringing down one man, but there are others. Powerful people, people who can make you disappear without a trace. I've already won. Isabella felt a cold chill run through her. This wasn't just about putting away one criminal. It was about toppling an entire network, a system of power that reached far beyond her understanding. But she couldn't let fear take hold. She had to finish this. You won't get away with this, she said, her voice hardening. Just as she stepped forward, preparing to make the arrest, the sound of a door slamming open behind her made her freeze. In the blink of an eye, 3 men entered the room, their guns raised and aimed at Isabella and her team. Russo's smirk widened as he watched the scene unfold. You don't get it, do you, Detective? Russo's voice was now laced with amusement. You think I'm alone, but I've got friends, big friends, people who are willing to do whatever it takes to protect me. Isabella's mind raced. This was bad, very bad. The plan had been to bring him in quietly, but now they were caught in a standoff. She glanced quickly at Burke, signaling him to stay calm. One wrong move, and everything could fall apart. As the men closed in, Isabella's instincts kicked in. She knew that the only way out was to act fast. Too many lives were at risk. She drew her weapon and fired at one of the men, taking him down in one swift motion. Burke followed suit, dropping another assailant to the ground. But Russo's men were prepared. The gunfire erupted in a series of deafening cracks, and Isabella was thrown back by the force of a bullet grazing her shoulder. She gritted her teeth, ignoring the pain as she ducked behind a nearby desk. In the chaos, Russo's voice rang out, sharp and mocking. "You think you can stop me? You're too late, detective. Too late for everything." Isabella's vision blurred for a moment as she fought the pain in her shoulder, but she didn't lose focus. She couldn't. Not now. This wasn't just about bringing down one man. It was about dismantling an entire empire. But Russo wasn't going down without a fight, and as Isabella scrambled to regain her footing, she realized something chilling. The battle for control of this city was far from over, and worse, there were still people lurking in the shadows, waiting to betray her at every turn. The war wasn't just against criminals. It was against a corrupt system that had embedded itself in every corner of society. This was personal, and it was only getting started. The police backup arrived moments later, swarming the building with reinforcements. Russo and his men were quickly subdued, taken into custody with the same ruthlessness he had once used against his enemies. Isabella, though battered and bruised, had won the fight, at least for now. But the truth was clear. The enemy was far more entrenched than she had realized. The real war was still ahead. The chaos of the standoff seemed to stretch on forever in Isabella's mind. Her body ached, her shoulder burned from the bullet wound, and her thoughts swirled with everything that had just transpired. Carmine Russo had finally been taken into custody, but his words, his mocking arrogance, echoed in her ears. He had been the mastermind, the puppet master who had pulled the strings of the city's criminal empire from the shadows. But what did that really mean? Who else was still out there? As the building was secured and her team ensured no other threats lingered in the dark corners of the crumbling structure, Isabella sat on the edge of a metal chair, trying to process everything. Burke walked over to her, his face pale but determined. The tension between them was palpable, each of them understanding the weight of what had just happened, but neither willing to let their guard down. "You all right?" Burke asked, his voice softer than usual. Isabella glanced down at her bloodied shoulder, the adrenaline starting to ebb. "It's nothing," she muttered, gritting her teeth against the pain. "It'll heal." But Burke wasn't buying it. He nodded toward the officers taking Russo away in handcuffs. "You know, this doesn't feel like a victory. We've taken down Santini and now Russo. But something doesn't sit right with me. I think we're still missing something." Isabella's gaze drifted to the window, watching the flashing red and blue lights of the police cars as they painted the night sky. "I know. I've been feeling that too. The empire's falling apart, but I'm not sure we've uncovered everything yet. It's too clean." Burke sat down beside her, the quiet tension of the moment pressing down on both of them. He shifted in his seat, clearly wrestling with his own thoughts before speaking. "I've been looking at the financial records again, and there's one thing that stands out. There's a name that keeps popping up in all the money transfers. Someone who we haven't talked about yet. Someone who might have been more involved than we thought." Isabella's heart skipped. "Who?" Burke looked down at his notes as though weighing whether or not to say it out loud. "Lydia Russo." Isabella froze. "Lydia Russo? You're telling me?" Burke nodded. "She was part of the operation, Isabella. I don't think she was just a bystander. We've seen her name in everything, from the laundering schemes to the illicit deals with Santini. And it's not just the business side. She's been involved in all of it. I think we've underestimated her." Isabella's mind reeled. It was all starting to make sense. Lydia Russo, the woman who had been in a relationship with Santini, who had played the role of a loyal wife, had been hiding her true intentions all along. She had played everyone: Santini, her father, even herself. She had orchestrated it all: the marriage, the alliances, the financial ruin of Moretti, and the eventual betrayal of the DeLucas. But why? What was her ultimate goal? Suddenly, the pieces began falling into place. Lydia had been much more than a victim or a pawn in this game. She had been the one pulling the strings behind the scenes, manipulating everyone. Her father, Santini, even the Moretti family. The idea that she had been a mere bystander was absurd. Isabella's thoughts raced. We need to talk to her. We need to find her before she disappears. She's the last piece of the puzzle. Isabella's team quickly mobilized, diving deep into their investigation of Lydia Russo's whereabouts. Burke was already making calls to get Lydia's location traced, using the connections within the department to get their hands on the latest intel. But even as they prepared to move in on her, Isabella had the unsettling feeling that Lydia was already one step ahead. As the team prepared for the next phase, the aftermath of the raid settled over Isabella like a weight she couldn't shake off. There was so much more to this than just bringing down a few criminals. Lydia's role had never been clear to anyone. Not to Santini, not to her father, and certainly not to the police. But now it was obvious. Lydia was the true architect of the destruction that had ripped apart not just the Moretti family, but so many others along the way. The phone rang just as Isabella was reviewing the latest evidence. She answered quickly. "Detective Rossi, it's Burke," came the voice on the other end, quick and sharp. "We found her. She's at a condo downtown. I don't know how long we have before she moves again. Get over here now." Without a word, Isabella grabbed her coat and headed out the door, her mind focused entirely on Lydia Russo. The woman was running out of places to hide. The trail had led them to her, a woman of ambition, power, and ruthlessness. But now the clock was ticking. The condo was tucked away on the 15th floor of a luxury building, a stark contrast to the rundown warehouses and dark alleys that had been the scene of most of their recent operations. It was clear that Lydia had chosen to surround herself with opulence, the very symbol of the wealth and power she had craved her entire life. But now the lavish setting would be her downfall. Isabella and her team carefully approached the building, weapons drawn but hidden. The plan was simple: move in fast and secure Lydia before she had a chance to make a run for it. They knew she had the resources to escape, but Isabella wasn't about to let that happen. They took the elevator to the 15th floor, the sound of their footsteps echoing in the quiet hallway. Isabella signaled to her team to fan out as they approached Lydia's door. It was ajar, just slightly, almost inviting them in. Isabella took a deep breath, her senses heightened, and then she kicked the door open. Inside, the apartment was spotless. Expensive furniture, fine art, and a view of the city skyline. But Lydia was nowhere to be found. Instead, a figure moved in the shadows, a soft laugh escaping her lips. "So, you've finally come for me," Lydia's voice rang out, calm and cold. Isabella's heart sank. She had known this wasn't going to be easy, but there was something eerie about Lydia's tone, something unsettling in the way she stood there, as if she was in complete control. "Lydia Russo," Isabella said, her voice steady, "you're under arrest for your role in the murders of Elena Moretti, Carmen De Luca, and the conspiracy to destroy the Moretti family. You're going down for everything." Lydia chuckled softly, stepping closer, her gaze locking onto Isabella's with an unsettling calmness. "You think arresting me will change anything? You think the empire will just crumble without me? You're wrong, detective. I've already won. Santini is gone. My father is useless. And I'll never go down like this. You'll never be able to stop me." Isabella's hand tightened around her weapon, but she remained composed. "You're not untouchable, Lydia. You're just another criminal hiding behind a facade of power. And your time is up." For a split second, Lydia's eyes flickered, just a hint of fear behind that confident mask. But before Isabella could react, Lydia lunged for a nearby drawer, pulling out a gun. The sharp crack of gunfire echoed in the room as Isabella dove to the ground, the bullet grazing her side. The force of it sent her crashing into a chair, but she fought through the pain, rolling behind a nearby wall for cover. Lydia's frantic footsteps echoed across the floor, and for a moment, Isabella was certain the woman would try to escape through the back door. But Lydia wasn't running. She was cornered, and that made her dangerous. But Isabella wasn't going to let her escape. With a swift motion, Isabella stood, fired, and in a split second, Lydia dropped to the ground, the gun falling from her hand. It was over. Hours later, as Isabella stood in the hospital room, her arm in a sling, she reflected on everything that had led to this moment. The Morettis, the De Lucas, Santini, Russo. Those lives were gone, lost to the darkness of greed and betrayal. But at least now justice had been served. Isabella stared out the window, the city lights twinkling below. She had been in this fight for too long to let it define her. But tonight, she had finally put an end to the destruction. There was no more empire, no more lies, just the quiet, cold truth of a city forever changed. And for the first time in a long time, she felt the weight of it all finally lift. The reckoning had come.